when a decorated soldier was given an alien female as a war prize. He never expected this Captain Ryan Grant was a decorated soldier, known throughout the Earth Alliance for his bravery and tactical genius. He had fought in countless battles against the alien forces that had come from beyond the stars, each victory bringing humanity closer to winning the war. But nothing could prepare him for the moment when he was handed his latest reward. The war was nearing its end, and humanity had suffered many losses. Entire cities had been wiped off the map, entire generations lost in the fight for survival. But in the midst of the chaos, Earth had found a way to fight back, and now they were pushing the invaders back to the stars. It was a rare victory in an ongoing conflict that had seemed endless. Ryan had been part of the final push. Leading his squad of elite soldiers, they had fought fiercely on the alien homeworld, pushing the invaders back inch by inch, until the enemy's defense had finally crumbled. It had been a costly victory, but a victory nonetheless. It was after this battle that Ryan received a special prize from the higher-ups in the military. He wasn't sure what to think when the order came through. A war prize? A token of victory, perhaps. At first, he assumed it was just another medal, another display of recognition. But when he was summoned to the military base's command center, he found himself face to face with something he never expected. A female alien stood before him, shackled and silent, her eyes betraying a hint of sadness, but also strength. The military had captured her during the final battle, a high-ranking officer from the invading alien faction. She was their trophy, their proof of humanity's triumph. Her name was Alara, and she was now Ryan's responsibility. Ryan looked at her with cold indifference. He had fought in the war for so long, seen so much destruction, that the idea of having an alien as a prize didn't even faze him. What bothered him more was the idea of having to care for her. He didn't want her. He didn't want anything to do with this war anymore. He had been promised rest, a chance to recover from the years of bloodshed. But now he was expected to take care of an enemy, one that had been part of the very force that had caused so much destruction. The military brass explained that Alara was to be kept under his supervision. She was a symbol, a living trophy of humanity's victory. They intended to show her off to the public, a reminder of how far Earth had come. Ryan was not pleased by this. He wasn't interested in being part of a propaganda campaign, but as an officer, he didn't have a choice. The orders were clear. He led Alara to a secure holding room where she would be kept until further instructions. She moved silently, her eyes avoiding his gaze, and for a moment Ryan felt something strange stir within him. He couldn't understand why she wasn't reacting more strongly. Shouldn't she be angry? Shouldn't she be fighting back? But she was. She was silent, resigned. It made him uncomfortable. For days, Ryan didn't interact with her much. He had his own duties to attend to, and Alara was kept under the watchful eye of the military guards. He often passed by her room only to find her sitting quietly, her eyes distant, lost in thought. It was clear that she wasn't just any alien soldier. There was something different about her. But Ryan didn't care to explore what that might be. She was an enemy, and that was all that mattered to him. However, as the days turned into weeks, Ryan found himself reluctantly drawn to her. It started with small things. A glance from the corner of his eye as he walked past her cell, the way her eyes followed him, always observing but never speaking. He couldn't ignore the quiet intensity in her gaze. She wasn't just a prisoner. She was someone who had lived through something just like him. The war had left scars on everyone, no matter which side they fought for. One afternoon, as Ryan was finishing a report in his office, there was a soft knock at the door. He looked up to see one of the guards standing there looking uncomfortable. "Sir, the alien Alara, she requests to speak with you." Ryan raised an eyebrow. Speak with him. What could she possibly want? He had no interest in conversing with her, but something in the guard's voice made him pause. "Fine," he said. "Bring her in." A few moments later, Alara was standing before him, her hands still bound, though her posture was more upright than before. She held herself with dignity despite the circumstances. Ryan couldn't help but notice how calm she seemed. She wasn't trembling in fear like most of the prisoners had been. She was composed, controlled. "What do you want?" Ryan asked, his voice cold and businesslike. Alara's eyes met his, and for the first time Ryan saw something other than the blank expression she usually wore. There was curiosity there, a glimmer of something more. "I am not your enemy," she said, her voice soft but firm. Ryan frowned. "You're an enemy soldier." You fought against Earth." "No," she replied, shaking her head slightly. "I was forced to fight. I never wanted this war." Ryan leaned back in his chair, studying her. He had heard similar stories before, soldiers from both sides claiming they were forced into the conflict. But there was something about Alara's words that struck him differently. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the way she spoke them, like she had been carrying a heavy burden for far too long. "You're telling me you didn't want to fight?" Ryan asked skeptically. Alara nodded. "No, my people were manipulated. The war was not our choice, but we were made to believe it was our only path. We were made to believe Earth was the enemy. But I see now that the true enemy is not just one side or the other. It is those who seek to control us all." Ryan stared at her, trying to make sense of what she was saying. He had always been taught that the aliens were the enemy, beasts who came from another galaxy, intent on conquering humanity. But Alara's words were different. They didn't fit the narrative he had been raised with. Could it be possible? Could they all be pawns in a bigger game? Before he could respond, Alara spoke again. "I am not your prisoner, I am not your war prize, I am a person just like you, and I have my own story to tell." Ryan didn't know what to say to that. The walls he had built around himself for so long were beginning to crack. This wasn't what he had expected. He thought she would beg for her life, plead for mercy. Instead, she was offering him something far more dangerous, a chance to see the world through her eyes. For the first time in his life, Ryan felt something stir within him, a sense of curiosity. Who was this alien? And why was she so different from the others he had fought against? He stood up and motioned for her to sit. "Tell me your story," he said. "I'm listening." And so Alara began to speak. She told him of her people, of the lies they had been fed, of the war that had torn them apart. She spoke of the pain and the loss, of the families left behind, of the lives destroyed by a conflict they never wanted to fight. Ryan listened, and as he did, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the war, about the aliens, and about himself. For the first time in a long time, Ryan felt something other than anger. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a spark, a tiny flicker of something new, and that was enough to change everything. In the days that followed, Ryan found himself thinking about Alara more than he cared to admit. It wasn't just the way she had spoken to him during their first conversation, though her calm confidence had stayed with him. No, it was the way she had looked at him, like she saw through him, past his armor, past the soldier he was trained to be. Ryan had always thought of himself as someone who understood the harsh realities of war, someone who had seen enough bloodshed to last a lifetime. But Alara's eyes, filled with a depth that seemed to carry the weight of entire worlds, had made him question everything. It started with small things. Ryan found himself walking past her holding cell more often than he needed to. It wasn't out of duty or obligation. He simply couldn't help it. Each time he would glance inside, seeing her sitting quietly, her eyes fixed on something far away. She never asked for anything. She never begged for sympathy. She just sat there, alone in a world she didn't belong to, waiting for something that neither of them could understand. On one of those afternoons, when the sun was dipping low in the sky and the base was quieter than usual, Ryan stopped in front of her cell. Alara's gaze met his instantly, and for a moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them. It was strange, and Ryan couldn't quite explain it, but he felt as though they were connected in some way, even though they had just met. "Do you ever talk to anyone here?" Ryan asked, leaning against the doorframe. Alara's voice was soft when she answered, but there was strength in it. "Not really. I have no one left to talk to." The words hit Ryan harder than he expected. She had been through so much, more than anyone should have to endure. And yet here she was, trapped on a strange planet with no allies, no friends, and no place to call home. He didn't know what to say in response. His mind raced, but nothing came out. "Would you like to talk?" he asked after a long pause. Alara looked up at him, her eyes steady. "You're offering to listen?" Ryan nodded slowly. "I don't have many answers, but I can listen." She studied him for a moment, weighing the sincerity in his offer. Finally, she nodded, her face softening just a little. "I guess I could tell you about my people," she said. And so Alara began to speak. Her voice was low but clear, carrying a weight that Ryan had not anticipated. She spoke of her home, a world far from Earth, of vast landscapes and strange skies, a place of beauty and wonder. But it had been shattered by war, just like Earth. Her people had been manipulated into fighting a war they didn't believe in, drawn into a conflict they never chose. She spoke of her own struggles, her own doubts, and the way her world had crumbled under the pressure of forces greater than any of them could control. As Ryan listened, he found himself drawn into her story. He had always thought of the aliens as faceless enemies, just another force to be defeated in the war. But now, he realized that they were not so different from the humans he fought alongside. They were just people who had been forced into a terrible situation. The anger and resentment that he had held onto for so long began to fade, replaced by something else, something softer. Alara's voice faltered as she spoke of the loss she had experienced, her family, her friends, and the home she would never see again. Ryan could hear the pain in her words, the grief that lingered beneath her calm exterior. He wanted to say something, anything to comfort her, but the words didn't come. Instead, he just listened, sitting in silence with her as the weight of her story settled in the air between them. After a while, Alara fell quiet, her eyes distant once more. She hadn't finished her story, but she seemed to have said all that she could for now. Ryan didn't know how to respond, so he simply nodded and stood up. "I'll leave you to rest," he said softly, "but if you ever want to talk again, I'll be here." Alara glanced up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, perhaps a flicker of hope. "Thank you," she said quietly. As Ryan walked away, he felt something shift inside him. It was like a knot that had been tied tight for years had finally loosened. The anger, the bitterness, the hatred he had carried with him, it was all beginning to unravel. He had never thought of the war in these terms. To him, it had always been about victory, about defeating the enemy. But now, for the first time, he was seeing the war through the eyes of someone who had been on the other side. Someone who had been just as much a victim as those who had lost their lives in the conflict. Over the next few days, Ryan found himself spending more and more time near Alara's cell. He didn't visit her every day, but when he did, he couldn't help but notice how much more comfortable she seemed. She no longer sat in silence, staring into the distance. She had started to talk more, sharing bits and pieces of her life before the war. They would talk about simple things, about food, about the stars, about the things that made them human, things that had nothing to do with the war. And though Ryan couldn't quite explain it, he started to look forward to their conversations. It was strange, and it made him uneasy. He was a soldier, not a counselor. He wasn't supposed to care about a prisoner, especially not one who had been part of the alien forces. But he did. He couldn't help it. One evening, after another long day of paperwork and military briefings, Ryan found himself once again standing in front of Alara's cell. He had just come from a meeting with his superiors, where he had been briefed on the upcoming propaganda campaign. They wanted to showcase Alara as a symbol of Earth's victory, but Ryan was beginning to feel uncomfortable with the idea. She wasn't just a symbol, she was a person. And the more he learned about her, the harder it became to see her as anything else. Alara was sitting on the floor when he approached, her legs crossed in front of her, her back straight. She looked up as he approached, her eyes meeting his. "Ryan," she said, her voice still soft but now tinged with something that resembled warmth. "Alara," he replied, giving her a small nod. "How are you today?" She shrugged slightly, though there was a faint smile on her lips. "Better, every day a little bit better." For the first time, Ryan smiled in return. It wasn't much, just a small quirk of his lips, but it felt like something important had shifted. They were no longer just soldier and prisoner. They were two people, connected by a shared understanding of the pain the war had caused. "I'm glad to hear that," he said quietly, his voice softer than usual. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened between them hanging in the air. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that comes from two people who have found some kind of understanding, even without words. Ryan didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know what the future held or how the war would end. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, things could be different. He didn't know if he could change the world or if he could change the way he saw it. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't look at Alara the same way again. Ryan couldn't stop thinking about Alara. It wasn't just the way she looked at him anymore, or the way her voice carried the weight of her stories. It was the unsettling realization that he had been living in a world full of lies. Lies about the enemy, lies about the war, lies about who the true villains were. Alara had opened his eyes to something he had never considered. She wasn't just a prisoner. She wasn't just the enemy. She was a person, a victim of the same forces that had shaped his own life. The more Ryan spent time with her, the more the pieces started to fall into place. It was like a puzzle he had been trying to solve for years, and now, slowly, he was beginning to understand the bigger picture. He had always believed that Earth was fighting for its survival, that the alien forces were the ones threatening everything they held dear. But Alara's words had shaken him. She had said that her people weren't the true enemy, that they had been manipulated just like the humans had been, and Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. One day, after another grueling meeting with his superiors about the upcoming propaganda campaign, Ryan found himself walking toward the briefing room with a heavy heart. The meetings had become repetitive, each one more tedious than the last. The higher-ups were obsessed with turning Alara into a symbol, a trophy to show off to the public. They wanted to paint a picture of triumph, of a glorious victory over an alien menace. But Ryan couldn't help but feel that they were missing the point entirely. He had been hearing the same things over and over, talk of future military conquests, the need to showcase humanity's strength, and how Alara was just a part of that strategy. But what they didn't realize, or perhaps didn't care to realize, was that Alara was more than just a symbol of victory. She was a key to understanding the truth about who had really started the war and why it had lasted for so long. After the meeting, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He needed to know more. He needed to understand the bigger picture. And he knew that the only way to do that was to confront the truth, even if it meant stepping outside the boundaries of what he had been taught. Ryan returned to his quarters and sat in front of his desk, staring at the various reports scattered in front of him. His eyes flicked to the small communicator on his desk, a device that allowed him to communicate with his superiors and other military officials. He had used it countless times before to follow orders, but today it felt different. He was no longer just following orders. He was searching for answers. He stood up and paced around the room, his mind racing. He needed to speak to Alara. She had mentioned something during their last conversation, something that he couldn't quite forget. She had hinted at the existence of a human faction that had been pulling the strings behind the scenes, manipulating both humans and aliens to keep the war going. The thought made Ryan uneasy, but it also made him curious. Could it be true? Could the war be the result of something far more sinister than he had ever imagined? The idea gnawed at him, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. He needed to find out the truth. He needed to speak to Alara again. Ryan made his way to her holding cell, his steps quickening with each passing moment. When he arrived, he found Alara sitting quietly, her back against the wall, staring off into space. She didn't look up when he entered, but she must have sensed his presence because she spoke without turning to face him. "What is it you want to ask this time, Captain Grant?" she said, her voice calm but with an edge of weariness. Ryan hesitated, unsure of how to begin. But the truth was burning inside him, and he knew he had no choice but to ask the question that had been plaguing his mind. "Alara," he began, his voice steady but serious. "You said that your people weren't the real enemy, that someone else was pulling the strings. Who are they? Who's behind all of this?" Alara's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, Ryan thought she might not answer, but then she sighed deeply and stood up, her posture more guarded than usual. "You've been paying attention, haven't you?" she said softly, her voice low as if she were afraid of being overheard. "You're not wrong. The war wasn't started by my people, and it wasn't started by yours either. There are those who have been manipulating both sides to keep the conflict going, to keep the galaxy in turmoil." Ryan felt a chill run down his spine. "Who are they?" he asked again, his voice urgent. "Who's been pulling the strings?" Alara looked around cautiously before leaning closer to him, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They're human," she said, her eyes darkening with a mix of anger and fear. "There's a faction of humans who are more powerful than you could ever imagine. They've been working behind the scenes for years, controlling the flow of resources, manipulating governments, and inciting wars for their own benefit. They don't care about your people or mine. All they care about is profit and control." Ryan's heart pounded in his chest. "But why? Why would they want this war?" Alara paused for a moment, her gaze flickering as if she were trying to find the right words. "The war is profitable," she said finally. "It gives them power, it keeps them in control. As long as there's conflict, there's money to be made and there's influence to be gained. They've been playing both sides, human and alien, using us like pawns in their game." Ryan shook his head, struggling to process what she was telling him. This doesn't make sense. How can they have so much power? Why hasn't anyone found out about them? Alara gave him a wry smile, though there was no humor in it. They've been careful. They've infiltrated every level of government, every faction. They're not just some underground group. They've positioned themselves at the very top, where no one can reach them. They control everything. Ryan's mind was spinning. The war, the years of suffering, the countless lives lost, all of it had been orchestrated by a group of people who were nothing more than opportunists. He felt a sense of betrayal like never before. Everything he had fought for, everything he had believed in had been a lie. "But why are you telling me this?" Ryan asked, his voice shaky. "You're one of them. You were part of the invasion. Why help me?" Alara's expression softened, and for a moment Ryan saw the vulnerability in her eyes. "I'm not one of them," she said quietly. "I was a soldier just like you. I didn't know the truth. I was a pawn just like everyone else. But now that I know the truth, I can't sit back and let this continue. I can't let them win." Ryan was silent for a long time, processing her words. He had always believed that the enemy was the other side, that they were the ones responsible for the war. But now the lines were blurring. The real enemy wasn't just the aliens. It wasn't just the soldiers on the other side of the battlefield. It was something much bigger, something that had been controlling everything from the shadows. "What do we do now?" Ryan asked, his voice filled with resolve. "How do we stop them?" Alara looked at him, her eyes filled with determination. "We fight back, we expose them, we show the galaxy the truth. We may not have the power to defeat them on our own, but together we can start a revolution." Ryan nodded slowly, his heart burning with a newfound purpose. He had no idea how they would accomplish it, but one thing was clear: the war was far from over. The real battle was just beginning. Ryan's mind raced with the new truth Alara had revealed. Everything he had known about the war, everything he had fought for, had been based on lies. It felt like the ground beneath his feet had been ripped away. The enemy wasn't just the alien invaders. It was something far more dangerous: human greed and manipulation, hidden behind the mask of war. Now, Ryan couldn't simply turn a blind eye. He couldn't go back to the way things were before, marching off to fight with blind loyalty. This war wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about exposing the truth. Alara had become a source of clarity, a guide through the darkness. She wasn't just an alien prisoner, she was a partner in a fight for justice. Ryan wasn't sure how they would manage to bring down a powerful faction like the one she spoke of, but he knew one thing: he couldn't do it alone. They had to act fast. The higher-ups in the Earth military would never allow the truth to come out, and every day they delayed, the more power the shadowy faction would gain. Ryan and Alara were up against not just an enemy fleet, but an entire system of corruption. The world they once thought they knew was more complex than they could have ever imagined. One evening, in the dimly lit room where Ryan had spent countless hours drafting mission plans, he sat with Alara, his face tired but determined. Alara's gaze was steady, her usual calm demeanor unwavering. She had shared with him everything she knew about the secret faction, a powerful syndicate that controlled the highest levels of government, finance, and military power. They had manipulated the entire war, keeping both humans and aliens in a state of constant conflict to further their own ends. The more Ryan learned, the angrier he became. This war had never been about survival, it had been about control and profit. The lives lost, the cities destroyed, none of it had mattered to the people at the top. Ryan leaned forward, his hands clenched into fists on the table. "We can't just let them get away with this. We need to expose them. We need to tell everyone what's really going on." Alara nodded. "You're right, but it won't be easy. They have eyes everywhere. We'll need to be careful. We'll need allies." Ryan looked at her, his expression hardening. "Allies, but who? Who can we trust?" Alara's eyes darkened. "There are factions within Earth that have resisted the Syndicate's control. Underground movements, rebel groups, but they're scattered and divided. We'll need to unite them. If we can get them to work together, we might have a chance." Ryan sat back, processing her words. It sounded impossible. Uniting different factions, most of whom had their own agendas, was no easy task. But he couldn't ignore the sense of purpose he felt now. The war had started as a fight for survival, but now it was a fight for something much more important: the truth. And the truth needed to be heard. "We'll start small," Ryan said, his voice resolute. We'll find those who are willing to fight, we'll build a coalition, and once we have enough support, we'll go after the heart of the syndicate. We'll expose their lies for everyone to see. Alara's eyes flickered with approval. It's risky, but it's the only way. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, planning, and cautious steps toward the rebellion they were about to spark. They worked quickly, reaching out to various underground groups, resistance fighters, former soldiers, and civilians who had been living in fear of the syndicate's control. At first, it seemed like a long shot. These groups were disjointed, their leaders suspicious of outsiders, and many had been fighting their own battles for so long that they had little faith in anyone else. But Ryan and Alara had something they didn't, a clear goal and a shared purpose. Through careful negotiation and countless conversations, Ryan and Alara managed to convince the leaders of several factions that their fight wasn't just about one side winning the war. It was about ending the war altogether. It was about taking down the powerful few who had kept everyone in the dark. Slowly, the pieces started to fall into place. The rebel groups, once fractured and distrustful, began to join forces. One of the most difficult moments came when Ryan had to confront an old comrade, Captain Hayes, a man he had fought beside in the early days of the war. Hayes had risen through the ranks quickly, and while he was respected by many, he had also been loyal to the very system that Ryan now wanted to tear down. Ryan knew that confronting him would be a challenge, but it was a necessary step if they were going to unite the rebellion. When they met, Hayes was skeptical. "You're telling me we've been fighting the wrong enemy this whole time?" he asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. "After all the blood we've shed, you expect me to believe this conspiracy nonsense?" Ryan stood firm, his eyes locked on Hayes. "It's not nonsense. We've been manipulated. We've been fighting a war that wasn't our own. The people who have been pulling the strings are still out there, controlling everything. If we don't act now, they'll continue to keep us at war and more lives will be lost." Hayes looked away, clearly conflicted. Ryan could see the doubt in his eyes, the hesitation. Finally, after a long silence, Hayes sighed. "I don't know if I believe you, Ryan. But I know you wouldn't lie to me. You wouldn't betray everything we've fought for." Ryan's voice softened. "I'm not betraying anything. I'm trying to stop this madness. We need to fight for something bigger than just Earth versus the aliens. We need to fight for the truth." Hayes didn't respond immediately. He stood there for a long time, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Finally, he nodded. "All right, I'll help. But we do this together, Ryan. We can't let the rest of the soldiers think we've gone mad." With that, another ally was gained, and the rebellion began to take shape. It wasn't just a ragtag group anymore. It was an organized force, growing in numbers, united by a shared vision of ending the war and exposing the corruption at the top. But their efforts didn't go unnoticed. As the rebellion gained traction, the syndicate began to take action. They sent their agents to track down Ryan and Alara to silence them before they could spread the truth. The closer they got to the heart of the syndicate, the more dangerous the mission became. Every step forward was met with resistance, and the stakes grew higher with each passing day. One evening, Ryan and Alara met in the safe house where they had been hiding. The tension was palpable, the weight of their mission pressing on their shoulders. "We're running out of time," Alara said, her voice quiet but filled with urgency. "We can't keep hiding like this. We need to act now." Ryan nodded. "I know, but we need more support. If we go in without enough backing, we'll be crushed before we even get the chance to expose them." Alara's eyes burned with determination. "Then we make our move tonight. We get the information we need and send it to the public. Let the world know what's really going on." Ryan hesitated for a moment, but then the same fire that had burned in him during his first battle for Earth reignited. He looked at Alara and nodded. "Let's do it." The final step had been taken. They had no idea what would happen next, but they knew one thing for sure. There was no turning back now. The rebellion had begun, and they were ready to fight for the truth, no matter the cost. The night was quiet, but Ryan could feel the tension in the air. It was the calm before the storm, the kind of silence that always seemed to settle in the moments before everything changed. He stood at the edge of the safe house, his eyes scanning the dark horizon. The lights of the city flickered in the distance, a reminder of the world they were fighting to save. It had been a long journey, and now the rebellion was finally ready to make its move. Alara approached quietly, her footsteps barely making a sound on the cold floor. She didn't say anything at first, but Ryan could feel the weight of the moment in her presence. She had been by his side through it all, the battles, the betrayals, the loss. Together, they had fought not just for survival, but for a chance to change everything. And now they stood on the edge of something even bigger. "We're ready," Alara said softly, her voice steady, but tinged with the same uncertainty that had been with them from the start. Ryan nodded, his hand tightening around the small device in his pocket. It was a simple piece of technology, but it held the key to everything they had worked for. The evidence they had gathered, proof of the syndicate's manipulation, the truth about the war, was ready to be broadcast to the entire galaxy. All they had to do was send it out, and the truth would be exposed. The power of the syndicate would be broken, and the war could finally end. But it wasn't that simple. They had no idea what kind of resistance they would face. The syndicate was powerful, and they wouldn't let go of their control easily. Ryan had spent years fighting on the front lines of this war, but now he was facing a different kind of battle, one for the future, one that didn't involve just military strength, but the strength of truth. "Do you think it'll work?" Alara asked, her voice breaking through his thoughts. Ryan looked at her, his expression serious. "It has to. If we don't do this, the war will never end. People will keep dying and nothing will change. We have no choice." Alara nodded slowly, her eyes filled with understanding. "We're doing the right thing, but it won't be easy. The syndicate will fight back. They'll do anything to stop us." Ryan sighed, feeling the weight of her words. "I know, but we've come this far. We can't stop now." They shared a moment of silence, standing together at the edge of the unknown. Ryan couldn't help but think of everything that had brought them here, the battles, the betrayals, the people they had lost. But in that silence, he also felt something else, a flicker of hope. They had started this journey as enemies, but now they were united in something bigger than themselves. They were fighting for a future where people could live in peace, where the truth would finally come to light. It was time to act. The safe house was filled with the quiet hum of machines and the soft murmur of voices from the rebellion's leaders, preparing for the final phase of their plan. Ryan and Alara walked toward the central room, where the device that would broadcast the evidence was waiting. They had spent days preparing for this moment, and now there was no turning back. Inside the room, the leaders of the rebellion were gathered, each one focused on their role in the operation. There was Captain Hayes, who had come around to their cause, his face set with determination. He had been one of Ryan's closest allies during the early days of the war, and now he was standing beside him, ready to make the final push. "We're ready to go," Hayes said, his voice calm, though his eyes betrayed a hint of nervousness. Ryan nodded. "Let's do this." With a steady hand, he approached the console, the device glowing softly in front of him. He plugged the data into the terminal, and for a moment, everything seemed to pause. There was a brief silence in the room as the information began to load, and Ryan couldn't help but feel the weight of what they were about to do. This was the moment that could change everything, the moment that would either break the syndicate's grip on the galaxy or seal their fate forever. The data flashed across the screen, revealing everything. The syndicate's involvement in the war, their manipulation of both sides, their control over the galaxy's governments and military forces. Ryan's heart raced as he watched the images and documents unfold before him. It was the truth they had fought so hard to uncover. But it wasn't just the evidence that mattered. It was the story that would be told when this broadcast went live. It was a story of betrayal, of manipulation, and of hope. It was a story that would unite people, that would bring an end to the conflict that had torn the galaxy apart. "Are you ready?" Alara's voice broke through his thoughts once again. Ryan took a deep breath, his finger hovering over the button that would send the broadcast out to the galaxy. For a moment, he thought of everything that had led him here, the battles, the losses, the sacrifices. He thought of the people who had died, the families torn apart. But more than anything, he thought of the future they could build if they succeeded. He nodded, his resolve hardening. "Let's do it!" With one press of the button, the broadcast went live. Immediately, the screens around them flickered to life. The evidence, the truth, began to spread across the galaxy, reaching millions of people in an instant. Ryan could hear the murmurs of the rebellion leaders behind him, their voices filled with anticipation. But Ryan wasn't listening to them. His focus was entirely on the screens in front of him. This was it, the moment they had all been waiting for. The response was immediate. The first few minutes were calm. Ryan had expected that. People needed time to process what they were seeing. But then the messages began pouring in, millions of responses from people all across the galaxy. News outlets picked up the broadcast, and soon the truth was everywhere. People were demanding answers. They were demanding justice. The Syndicate's grip on the galaxy was beginning to crack. Ryan felt a surge of hope. This was it. This was the beginning of the end. But then, just as they had expected, the Syndicate struck back. Within minutes of the broadcast, the rebellion's communications were cut off. The military forces loyal to the Syndicate began moving into position, preparing to shut down the rebellion for good. They had known this would happen, but it didn't matter. The truth had been exposed, and there was no going back. "We've done it," Alara said, her voice filled with a quiet sense of triumph. Ryan looked at her, his eyes shining with determination. "We've only just begun." The room erupted into chaos as the rebellion's forces prepared to defend against the Syndicate's retaliation. But Ryan knew that no matter what happened next, they had already won. The truth was out. The galaxy would never be the same again. The war was not over, but a new hope had been born. The people knew the truth, and that was more powerful than any weapon or army. Together they would rise up, and together they would end the conflict once and for all. And for the first time in a long time, Ryan felt like they had a chance. A chance to build a new future, one where peace was possible and where the truth would always shine through the darkness.